Why older adults keep waking up at 3 a.m. and what it really means for your health and sleep. Close your eyes and imagine this. The world is still, the quiet of the night enveloping you in its embrace. The clock strikes 3 a.m., yet sleep seems a distant dream. Instead of the peaceful rest you long for, your mind is alive with thoughts, worries, and perhaps even regrets from the day. You toss and turn, helpless, as if your body no longer follows the rhythm it once did so effortlessly. You ask yourself, why can't I sleep? Is there something wrong with me? If this scene is familiar, you're not alone. Countless older adults share this experience, waking up at 3 a.m. and wondering what is happening to their bodies and minds. But here's the twist. What if this moment is not a disruption, but rather an invitation to something much greater? What if, in these quiet hours, lies the key to understanding the deeper rhythms of your life? This video will unravel the mystery of why so many of us wake up at 3 a.m. and, more importantly, reveal how this shift in our sleep patterns could be part of a profound, natural evolution. This is not a flaw or a sign of illness. Rather, it's a spiritual awakening of sorts, a reminder that change is a part of our journey as human beings. Drawing on the wisdom of Buddhist teachings, which have guided seekers for thousands of years, we'll explore how everything, our bodies, our minds, and even our sleep, is in a constant state of change. Buddhism teaches us that nothing is permanent. Just like the seasons, our bodies' rhythms change as we age. Yet, instead of fighting this process, we can approach it with a sense of acceptance, understanding, and yes, even grace. But that's not all. What you're about to discover could change the way you see not just your sleep, but the very nature of your existence. This video is packed with insights that can help you embrace these changes, not as disruptions, but as opportunities for growth, self-awareness, and inner peace. From ancient wisdom to practical mindfulness tools, by the end of this video, you'll have the keys to unlock a deeper understanding of yourself and the world around you. If you've ever woken up in the stillness of the night and wondered if something is wrong, this video is for you. It's not just a video, it's an invitation to transform your perspective on life itself. So watch closely and prepare to see your sleep, your aging, and your very essence in a completely new light. Don't forget to hit like, share, and most importantly, subscribe. Because here we don't just share knowledge, we share timeless wisdom rooted in the heart of Buddhism that can change the way you live. Welcome to a journey that will deepen your connection to yourself and the universe around you. Let's begin this extraordinary exploration together. Chapter 1: Embracing the Change. As we grow older, the subtle shifts in our bodies and minds can often feel like a disruption, something to be fixed or feared. We experience physical changes, from a slight aching in our joints to shifts in our sleep patterns, and we may wonder why things don't work the way they once did. It's easy to view these changes as problems, something that signals the decline of our youth. But what if, instead of fighting these changes, we welcomed them? What if we could see them not as obstacles, but as invitations to grow deeper, to awaken to the wisdom of our lives, and to find peace even in the smallest of changes? In Buddhism, we are taught that everything in life is impermanent. The Buddha's first noble truth tells us that suffering arises from attachment to the way things should be. We cling to the way we used to be, the way our bodies once felt, the way we once slept through the night. But change is the one constant in life, and it's only through accepting and embracing that change with mindfulness that we can free ourselves from the suffering caused by resistance. One of the most noticeable changes as we age is a shift in our sleep patterns. As our bodies evolve, melatonin production, the hormone responsible for regulating our sleep cycle, naturally decreases. Melatonin levels, once abundant in our youth, begin to fade, and many older adults find themselves waking up in the middle of the night, particularly around 3 a.m. For some, this becomes a regular occurrence, and they may feel as if something is wrong. They question their health or worry about their mental state. But what if this is not a flaw to be fixed? What if this is just a natural part of the cycle of life? The story of Harold, a 72-year-old man, illustrates this beautifully. For years, Harold was a sound sleeper, never thinking twice about his nighttime rest. But as the years passed, he began waking up at 3 a.m. night after night. At first, he felt alarmed, as if there were something wrong with his body, as if his health was deteriorating. But then, through the lens of mindfulness and Buddhist teachings, he realized this wasn't a malfunction of his body, it was simply a sign of change. Buddhism teaches that change is neither good nor bad, it just is. Harold recognized that, like the seasons changing, his body's rhythms were shifting. Rather than seeing these changes as a threat or a flaw, Harold began to approach them with acceptance. Instead of resisting the early wake-up, he adjusted his routine. He dimmed the lights earlier in the evening, refrained from looking at screens, and created a more calming atmosphere before bed. Through these mindful practices, Harold found peace during his wakeful hours. Rather than turning the early morning hours into a source of frustration, he used them as a time for quiet reflection. The message here is clear. Waking up at 3 a.m. is not a sign of failure. It is simply an invitation to reconnect with ourselves in the stillness of the night. By approaching this natural shift in our body's rhythm with curiosity and acceptance, we can transform what might feel like an inconvenience into an opportunity for growth. The story of Harold is just one example of how we can shift our mindset when faced with the inevitability of change. Buddhism encourages us to meet life as it comes, not as we wish it to be. In the same way that we embrace the changing of the seasons, knowing that winter will turn to spring and spring to summer, we must learn to embrace the changes that come with aging, especially when it comes to our sleep. One of the core teachings of Buddhism is mindfulness, the practice of being fully present in the moment without judgment. In moments of change, especially those that challenge us, mindfulness offers us a way to navigate them with grace. When Harold woke up at 3 a.m., he could have allowed his mind to spiral into frustration and anxiety. Instead, he practiced mindfulness by simply acknowledging the shift. Rather than fighting the change, he observed it with compassion. The Buddhist practice of equanimity, the ability to remain calm and balanced in the face of change, is one that can greatly help us as we age. Equanimity is not about denying the discomforts of life, but rather about embracing them with understanding and a gentle heart. This helps us to recognize that discomfort, whether physical or emotional, is not something to push away. Rather, it is a part of life, one that we can respond to with compassion for ourselves. Our bodies age and our minds shift. These changes are not to be feared, but rather seen as opportunities to deepen our understanding of ourselves. The older we get, the more opportunities we have to live in accordance with the impermanent nature of life. It is through our acceptance of change that we experience true peace. Take, for example, the story of Marie, a 65-year-old woman who had always been a light sleeper. She began waking up in the middle of the night around 3 a.m., but instead of worrying about it, she started using this time for reflection. She would sit up quietly, breathing deeply, and allow her mind to wander. Sometimes she would find herself reflecting on past relationships, on moments of joy and sorrow, and on the fleeting nature of her own life. Through these quiet, early morning hours, Marie began to see these awakenings not as interruptions, but as an opportunity to honor her life and the experiences that had shaped her. Marie's story serves as a reminder that when we stop resisting the changes in our bodies and our minds, we open ourselves to a deeper understanding of the impermanence of life. By embracing change, we can find peace in even the most challenging aspects of aging. In Buddhism, we are reminded time and time again that all things are impermanent. this is not just a philosophical concept. It is a way of understanding the world that can change how we experience our daily lives. The natural shift in our sleep patterns as we age is just one example of this impermanence. When we learn to accept these changes, we not only find peace in our bodies, but we also cultivate wisdom in our hearts. The invitation here is not just to accept change, but to celebrate it. Every shift, every change, every moment of wakefulness offers us an opportunity to grow in mindfulness, compassion, and understanding. The early morning hours are not something to dread. They are an opportunity to reconnect with the present moment, to reflect on our lives, and to embrace the wisdom that comes with age. As we embrace the changes that come with aging, whether in our sleep patterns or in our bodies, we free ourselves from the suffering that comes from resistance. Instead of lamenting the loss of our youth, we can celebrate the beauty of the journey that life offers us at every stage. Through mindfulness and acceptance, we learn to live fully in the present, embracing the impermanence of life with peace and grace. Chapter 2: A New Sleep Rhythm. As we journey through life, our bodies undergo a multitude of subtle transformations. One of the most profound changes comes not in the visible wrinkles or the slowing of our step, but in the inner workings of our body's rhythms, particularly our sleep patterns. This change is something that often catches us by surprise. As we age, many of us experience a shift in our circadian rhythms, a phenomenon known as advanced sleep phase, where we feel naturally tired earlier in the evening and consequently wake up earlier, often before the sun even rises. At first glance, this might seem like an inconvenience, something to be corrected or fixed. We might find ourselves waking up at 3 a.m., lying there in the quiet, feeling like we should still be resting. Our thoughts might spiral into frustration, questioning why we no longer enjoy the deep, uninterrupted sleep we once did. But as the Buddha taught, life is impermanent. This includes our bodies and our sleep patterns. To fight the inevitable changes of aging is to invite suffering into our lives. Instead, we are invited to meet these changes with mindfulness and grace, embracing them as part of the natural flow of life. Take the story of Charles, a 68-year-old retiree who, after years of working long hours, found himself waking up much earlier than he had before. His body, once accustomed to a different rhythm of sleep, now seemed to follow a new, earlier cycle. Initially, Charles was perplexed. He had always been someone who loved a full night's sleep, and this shift in his sleep pattern felt disruptive. At first, he resisted. He would toss and turn, desperately trying to fall back asleep, frustrated that his body no longer followed the same rhythm it once did. But instead of continuing to fight the natural evolution of his sleep cycle, Charles turned to mindfulness. In Buddhism, the practice of mindfulness teaches us to observe things as they are, without judgment. When Charles finally accepted his waking hours, he began to see them not as a problem, but as a gift, a time of stillness and quiet that was uniquely his. He stopped trying to force himself back to sleep and began to honor his body's new rhythm. By adjusting his routine, Charles discovered that the earlier wake-up time could be a time for peace and reflection, a time to reconnect with himself and his thoughts in a way he hadn't been able to in years. He started incorporating small changes to align with his body's new rhythm. He adjusted his evening routine, winding down earlier by reading or taking a short walk. Charles realized that by embracing this shift in his circadian rhythm, he could create a sense of harmony within himself. The early mornings no longer felt like interruptions, but became a sacred space for quiet reflection, a time to listen to his body and mind. This is where the teachings of Buddhism offer us profound insight. The Buddha spoke of suffering as an intrinsic part of life, not because we are meant to suffer, but because we resist the natural changes that occur. We suffer because we want things to stay the same, even when the nature of life tells us that nothing remains static. Just as the seasons shift from one to the next, so too do our bodies. The act of resisting this natural progression is what causes suffering, while embracing it with awareness and acceptance leads to peace. Charles' story is a powerful example of how we can adapt to the changes in our body's rhythms. Instead of pushing back against the new sleep cycle, he learned to honor it. This is a key lesson in Buddhist practice, to let go of attachment and to accept change as a part of the journey. The more we resist, the more we invite frustration and discomfort into our lives. But when we meet change with an open heart, when we allow ourselves to embrace it rather than fight it, we begin to transform that which we once saw as a disruption into a beautiful opportunity for self-awareness and peace. Consider the example of Mary, a 75-year-old woman who, after years of keeping a hectic schedule, found that her body no longer allowed her to stay awake as late as she once did. She began feeling naturally sleepy much earlier in the evening, and like Charles, she woke up around 4 a.m. every morning. Initially, Mary felt unsettled by the change. She found herself lying in bed, her mind racing with thoughts of missed sleep and worries about her health. But over time, she turned to mindfulness to help her accept this shift. Mary began to spend her early mornings in meditation, taking the time to reflect on her life, her purpose, and her sense of peace. She embraced the quiet hours not as a loss, but as a sacred space for introspection. With this shift, she found that her energy throughout the day improved, and her emotional well-being flourished. What seemed like an inconvenience became a moment of peace, a time to realign herself with the present moment. Mary's story teaches us that the early morning hours, once perceived as lost sleep, can become a time for deep reflection and rejuvenation when we meet them with mindfulness. When we honor our body's rhythms and trust in the wisdom that change brings, we are better able to live in harmony with the cycles of life. Buddhism teaches us that nothing in life is permanent. When we understand this truth deeply, we stop holding on to the idea that things should remain as they were, that our sleep should mirror the rest of our lives. We understand that our bodies, too, are constantly evolving. The early morning hours, when we find ourselves awake before the sun rises, can be an invitation to reflect, to practice mindfulness, and to be present with the natural rhythm of life. Rather than viewing early awakenings as a disruption, we can see them as an opportunity to listen more deeply to ourselves. It is a time to reflect on our thoughts, our emotions, and the impermanence of our own lives. These moments offer us a chance to reconnect with the present moment in a way that's often difficult to do during the busyness of the day. The Buddha encouraged us to embrace each moment with awareness and acceptance, knowing that change is the essence of life. Just as our bodies age and our sleep cycles shift, we can greet each change with grace, allowing it to deepen our practice of mindfulness and our connection to the present moment. In the wisdom of Buddhism, we learn that resistance to change is the root of suffering. When we cling to the past, to the way things used to be, we invite frustration and discontent. However, when we accept the changes in our sleep patterns, our bodies, and our minds, we can transform what might feel like a challenge into an opportunity for inner peace and growth. By embracing the natural rhythm of aging, whether it's an earlier bedtime, waking up at 3 a.m., or simply accepting the shifts in our circadian cycles, we learn to live in harmony with life's impermanence. The story of Charles and Mary reminds us that when we allow ourselves to adapt to these changes with mindfulness, we not only find peace, but also unlock the potential for a deeper connection with ourselves and the world around us. By embracing the natural ebb and flow of life's rhythms, we can cultivate a life of acceptance, compassion, and grace. Chapter 3: Physical Discomfort, an invitation for self-care. As we age, our bodies inevitably change. The once strong muscles that allowed us to move freely now feel stiffer. The joints that used to bend without effort may become sore. We wake up more often to visit the bathroom, and the ache in our back, knees, or shoulders seems to be a constant companion. These physical discomforts are part of the natural aging process, but they can be deeply unsettling. Many people experience frustration and restlessness, wondering why their bodies have become less cooperative. It's easy to fall into the trap of viewing these discomforts as something to fight or avoid, something that needs to be fixed. However, in Buddhist philosophy, we are taught to see suffering not as something to resist, but as an opportunity to practice mindfulness and self-compassion. Buddhism teaches that suffering, in its many forms, is a part of the human condition. However, the key to peace is not in eliminating all discomfort or avoiding pain, but in how we respond to it. The Buddha spoke of the Four Noble Truths, which explain that suffering is an inevitable part of life, but it is also an opportunity for transformation. The challenge is not to escape suffering, but to respond to it with wisdom, mindfulness, and compassion. This perspective is particularly relevant when we face physical discomfort, which can sometimes seem more pronounced as we age. When pain or restlessness interrupts our sleep, it's easy to feel defeated. But instead of fighting our discomfort or viewing it as a sign of weakness, we can use it as an opportunity to practice awareness and cultivate kindness towards ourselves. Take Alina, a 76-year-old woman who had been a light sleeper her entire life. Over the years, she had developed a range of physical discomforts, from mild arthritis to an occasional bout of back pain. However, it was her recent experiences of waking up in the middle of the night, often feeling restless and uneasy, that caused her the most concern. At first, she tried to simply ignore the discomfort, hoping it would pass on its own. But night after night, she found herself waking up, her body aching, her mind restless. She became frustrated, confused, and even a little angry. Why was this happening? Was it just another sign of the inevitable decline of age? One night, after a particularly restless evening, Alina had a moment of clarity. She remembered a teaching she had heard years ago, one that resonated deeply with her. Suffering is not something to be feared, it is an invitation to practice mindfulness. Alina realized that instead of resisting the discomfort and allowing frustration to rise, she could take a moment to be present with her body and listen to what it needed. Over the next few days, Alina decided to pay more attention to her body's signals. She practiced mindfulness, focusing on her breath and gently scanning her body to identify where the discomfort was coming from. With kindness and awareness, she acknowledged her physical pain without judgment. She noticed that her back pain seemed to worsen when she was lying on her side, and she realized that one of her medications might be contributing to her waking hours. Alina made an appointment with her doctor, explaining her symptoms. After discussing her concerns and experimenting with some adjustments to her medication regimen, she found a new routine that brought her relief. As she continued to embrace mindfulness and self-care, her sleep quality gradually improved, and the physical discomfort she had been resisting became more manageable. Alina's story is a powerful reminder that our physical discomfort can be a pathway to healing when we approach it with mindfulness and self-compassion. Instead of resisting or ignoring our pain, we can listen to our bodies and treat them with the kindness they deserve. Our bodies are constantly sending us messages, aches, pains, discomforts, that reflect not only our physical health, but also our mental and emotional well-being. The practice of mindfulness allows us to respond to these signals with awareness, rather than reacting out of frustration or fear. In Buddhism, we are taught the concept of Dharma, the teachings that guide us toward living with compassion, wisdom, and clarity. One of the fundamental aspects of the Dharma is the understanding that we are all interconnected, and how we treat our own bodies reflects how we treat the world around us. When we approach our discomforts with gentleness and mindfulness, we begin to cultivate a deep sense of respect for our bodies and our lives. This practice doesn't mean that we ignore our physical needs or deny the reality of pain. Rather, it teaches us to observe our discomfort with compassion, to understand its root cause, and to respond in a way that nurtures our health and well-being. It might mean making small changes in our lifestyle, seeking medical advice, or simply learning to rest more often. Another essential Buddhist teaching is karuna, compassion. The practice of compassion begins with ourselves. It means treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a dear friend who is suffering. When we approach our bodies and minds with this kind of tenderness, we open ourselves to healing. For example, if our knees ache from arthritis, instead of chastising ourselves for being weak or lamenting our lost youth, we can practice compassion by gently stretching or seeking out ways to relieve the pain. If we wake up in the night due to discomfort, rather than growing frustrated, we can take a moment to rest our mind, breathe deeply, and be present with what we are feeling. This simple act of acceptance can transform suffering into an opportunity for healing. Aliner's journey also highlights the importance of being proactive in self-care. While mindfulness can offer great insight and relief, we also need to take action. Sometimes the best way to care for ourselves is by seeking guidance from a doctor, adjusting our routines, or embracing new ways of living that align with our current needs. By listening to our bodies, we can adjust our actions and create a more harmonious life. As we age, physical discomfort may become a more frequent visitor in our lives. But instead of seeing it as something to fear, we can view it as an invitation to practice mindfulness, an invitation to treat ourselves with compassion, an invitation to listen, learn, and grow. Buddhism teaches us that everything is impermanent. Our bodies will change and discomfort will come and go, but how we respond to that discomfort can shape our inner peace. When we meet pain with understanding and respond with loving kindness, we can transform even the most challenging moments into opportunities for spiritual growth and healing. Aliner's journey is a testament to this wisdom. Through mindfulness and self-care, she found not only relief but a deeper connection with herself. In the end, the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the gift of compassionate self-care. When we embrace our physical discomforts with kindness and mindfulness, we allow ourselves to heal not only in body but in spirit. And in that healing, we discover a profound peace that transcends the pain. Chapter 4: Reflecting on Daily Habits. As we move through life, there comes a time when the rhythms of our daily routines start to shift. Perhaps it's the retirement from a long career, or simply the passage of years that causes us to spend more time at home, reflecting on the life we've lived and the life still to be lived. Our days become quieter, with fewer appointments to meet and less socializing to be done. For many, this shift leads to earlier bedtimes and earlier wake-ups. While at first this may seem like a mere result of aging, the teachings of Buddhism remind us that our habits, even the smallest ones, shape our experience of life in profound ways. Just as a gardener tends to their plants with care and attention, we too must nurture our habits with mindfulness. Buddhism teaches us that our actions, thoughts, and even our habits play a significant role in the life we create. Everything we do is part of the process of cultivating our karma. The seeds we plant today shape the experiences we have tomorrow. In this way, our habits are not merely a reflection of what we do, but of who we are and how we approach the world. A habit, no matter how small, can either pull us towards mindfulness and clarity or toward restlessness and confusion. At the core of Buddhist practice is mindfulness, the art of being fully present in the moment, aware of each thought, feeling, and action without judgment. This means being mindful not only of major decisions, but also of the seemingly trivial details of life, like how we wake up, how we spend our days, and how we engage with our surroundings. Our daily habits can either be an expression of mindfulness or an opportunity for the mind to drift aimlessly, consumed by distractions and unconscious patterns. One of the greatest gifts of the later years is the time to reflect on these habits. No longer bound by the busy schedule of work, we have the opportunity to create more intentional routines that nourish our body and mind and align us with the flow of life. This is not just about creating better sleep habits or eating healthier, though those are important, but about cultivating habits that foster peace, joy, and connection. Buddhism teaches that even the simplest habits, the way we greet the morning, the way we take our first steps of the day, have the power to influence the rest of our lives. Consider the story of Walter, a 74-year-old man who, after retiring from a busy career, began to notice changes in his daily routine. No longer waking up to the sound of an alarm clock or rushing off to work, Walter found that his days had become less structured. At first, this newfound freedom felt liberating, but soon Walter realized that his lack of a schedule had left him feeling restless. He found himself going to bed earlier, sometimes even falling asleep right after dinner, only to wake up at 3 a.m. feeling groggy and unsettled. His routine had been disrupted, and with it, his sense of balance. Walter's experience is not uncommon. As we age and our daily lives slow down, it's easy to fall into patterns that disrupt our natural rhythms. With fewer external responsibilities, we may find ourselves either overcommitting to rest or lacking the structure that we once had. And this lack of structure, while offering some peace, can also make us feel out of sync with our bodies and our environment. Rather than accepting this as inevitable, Walter took the Buddhist teachings of mindfulness to heart. He began to reflect on his habits with awareness, recognizing that the way he spent his days was shaping his nights. One of the most important changes he made was to incorporate a short walk into his afternoons. This simple act not only gave him some exercise, but also allowed him to reconnect with nature and bring some rhythm back to his days. He also made a conscious effort to avoid naps after dinner, as they were contributing to his restless early wake-ups. Through these small but meaningful adjustments, Walter found a greater sense of balance. The simple act of walking in the afternoon brought a sense of grounding and peace to his day. Avoiding naps allowed his body to follow a more natural rhythm, helping him sleep soundly through the night. More importantly, Walter found that by being mindful of his habits, even the smallest ones, he was cultivating a more peaceful and harmonious life. Walter's story is a reminder of the incredible power of mindfulness when it comes to our daily habits. Buddhism teaches that we must care for our habits as a gardener cares for their plants. A gardener knows that the growth of their plants depends on consistent care, watering, pruning, and tending to each one. Similarly, the habits we cultivate in our daily lives require our attention and intention. We must be aware of what we are watering, whether we are nurturing habits that bring us peace or those that lead to restlessness. For many, the transition into a quieter phase of life offers the perfect opportunity to reflect on these habits. We can ask ourselves, what habits am I cultivating, and are they truly serving me? How do I spend my mornings? What do I do when I wake up? How do I structure my days? By paying attention to these moments, we can begin to make small adjustments that will lead to greater peace and balance. A simple but powerful practice in Buddhism is the act of stilling the mind. Just as we would remove the weeds from a garden, we must remove the distractions from our thoughts. In the same way, by being mindful of our habits, we can begin to clear away the unhelpful patterns that cause us distress. If we feel restless or unsettled, it may be a sign that we need to make adjustments to our habits. Perhaps we need more movement in our day, more stillness, more connection with others, or simply more time for self-care. The beauty of aging, according to Buddhist wisdom, is that it offers us the time to reflect, to practice mindfulness, and to transform our daily lives. With fewer external distractions, we can focus more on the internal world, creating habits that reflect the peace and wisdom we seek. Each day is an opportunity to cultivate a new way of living, one that is in harmony with the natural rhythms of the body, the mind, and the universe. Through mindful reflection on our daily habits, we can begin to create a life that is more aligned with our values and our true needs. Just as Walter found peace through small changes in his routine, so too can we. By tending to our habits with care, we cultivate a life of balance, peace, and joy, a life that grows naturally and beautifully, just like a well-tended garden. The lesson here is clear. It's not the big, dramatic changes that make the greatest difference, but the small, intentional habits we nurture every day. By reflecting on these habits with mindfulness, we can begin to create a life that is more present, more grounded, and more aligned with the deepest wisdom of our hearts. Chapter 5: Emotional Restlessness, the Heart's Wisdom. In the stillness of the early morning hours, especially at 3 a.m., many of us experience a phenomenon that is as universal as it is profound: emotional restlessness. The world outside is silent, the pace of the day has long since paused, and the stillness of the night provides an unsettling space for unresolved emotions to rise to the surface. At times, these emotions have little to do with physical discomfort or the natural rhythms of aging. Instead, they are deeply embedded in the heart, whispering unresolved stories, regrets, or memories that we've either ignored or tucked away. Buddhism teaches us that emotions are not isolated occurrences to be fixed or suppressed. They are part of the interconnected flow of life. Just as the winds blow through the trees, our emotions flow through us, each one arising and passing away in its own time. The Buddha's teachings invite us to see emotions not as problems to be solved, but as natural responses to our life experiences. These emotions, however uncomfortable they may seem in the quiet of the night, are invitations to engage more deeply with our hearts, to listen to them with compassion, and to allow them to pass without judgment. In Buddhism, we learn that suffering often arises from our attachment to how things should be or our aversion to what we don't want to feel. Emotional restlessness, like the rest of life, is impermanent. It is a part of our human experience, one that cannot be avoided. But rather than seeing this restlessness as something to escape, the Buddha taught that it is an opportunity to cultivate mindfulness. Through mindfulness, we can create the space to observe our emotions with clarity and compassion. At night, when our minds are most vulnerable to reflection, it is easy for us to become overwhelmed by emotions that we would rather not face. For some, it's feelings of grief or loss. For others, it might be regret or a deep yearning for something lost in the past. The trick is not to force these emotions away, but to sit with them, acknowledging their presence without judgment or resistance. This practice of sitting with our emotions is central to Buddhist teachings on vipassana, insight meditation. By observing our emotions without becoming entangled in them, we learn that they are transient. No emotion, whether joy or sorrow, lasts forever. This awareness helps us approach emotional restlessness with equanimity rather than fear or avoidance. Take the story of Gloria, an 80-year-old widow who often woke up at 3 a.m. Since the death of her husband several years earlier, she found that these early morning awakenings became a regular part of her life. In the quiet darkness of the early morning, Gloria's heart would ache with memories of her late husband, the conversations they had shared, the simple moments they had enjoyed, and the profound loss she felt every day. At first, these waves of emotion were unsettling. She wanted desperately to return to sleep, to escape the quiet ache in her heart. But instead of resisting the emotions, Gloria turned to the teachings of mindfulness. Instead of trying to push the emotions aside or avoid the sorrow, Gloria began to embrace the feelings. She would get up and sit quietly by her bedside, allowing herself to feel the sadness without judgment or regret. Over time, Gloria began to write down her thoughts in a journal during these early hours. She would recount the memories of her husband, the love they had shared, and the grief that still lingered. By writing, she found a way to honor her emotions rather than suppress them. She also created quiet rituals that helped her connect with her feelings: a cup of tea, soft music, or a quiet prayer. These simple acts brought peace to her heart, helping her to process her emotions in a compassionate, mindful way. What Gloria discovered was that her emotional restlessness was not a sign of weakness or something to be avoided. It was simply a part of the natural ebb and flow of life. Through mindfulness, she began to understand that her grief, though painful, was not something that needed to be fixed. It was a reflection of the deep love she had for her husband, a love that would never truly fade, but would instead evolve as she moved forward in life. Gloria's ability to embrace her grief with kindness and awareness allowed her to heal, not by pushing the emotions away, but by making space for them to be. Buddhism teaches that self-compassion is one of the most powerful tools for navigating emotional pain. When we feel restless in the night, it is easy to become critical of ourselves, thinking that we should be stronger or more resilient. But the practice of self-compassion teaches us that it is okay to feel vulnerable. It is okay to experience sadness, anger, or confusion. These feelings are a part of being human, and by acknowledging them with kindness, we create the conditions for healing. When we wake up in the middle of the night, our emotional restlessness may feel like a burden, a disturbance in the peace we long for. But what if we reframed this experience? What if we saw these awakenings not as an interruption, but as an opportunity for personal growth? Every time we feel our hearts stir with emotion, we are invited to connect with the deeper wisdom within us. Our emotions are not obstacles, they are teachers. They provide us with insight into our hearts and minds, revealing what we still need to process or understand. Gloria's ability to welcome her emotions with open arms teaches us a powerful lesson. Rather than resisting the sadness, she embraced it and allowed it to flow through her. In doing so, she found peace not by escaping the sorrow, but by facing it with compassion. This is the heart of Buddhist wisdom: to approach our emotions with mindfulness, to recognize that they are part of our journey, and to honor them with patience and understanding. One of the core teachings of Buddhism is the idea of impermanence. Nothing, including our emotions, lasts forever. Whether we are experiencing the heights of joy or the depths of sorrow, these feelings are transient. In the stillness of the night, when emotions rise to the surface, it is important to remember that this too shall pass. Just as the waves of the ocean ebb and flow, so too do our emotions. Buddhism teaches that attachment to emotions is the source of much of our suffering. When we cling to emotions, whether positive or negative, we become trapped in their cycle. However, when we approach emotions with a sense of detachment, recognizing that they are temporary, we create the space to let them go. We can feel the emotion fully, honor its presence, and then allow it to dissolve without holding on to it. In this way, emotional restlessness, though unsettling at first, becomes a gateway to peace. When we accept our emotions as they come and go, without trying to control or resist them, we free ourselves from the cycle of attachment and suffering. This is not to say that emotions should be ignored or suppressed. Rather, they should be acknowledged and allowed to pass with understanding. Gloria's story offers a profound lesson in the art of embracing emotional restlessness. By acknowledging her emotions with compassion and mindfulness, she was able to find peace even in the quiet ache of loss. This practice, rooted in Buddhist teachings, reminds us that emotional restlessness is not something to fear, but something to embrace. It is an invitation to engage more deeply with ourselves, to reflect on our experiences, and to cultivate a heart of compassion. The heart's wisdom lies in its ability to hold both joy and sorrow, to accept both light and dark. Through mindfulness and self-compassion, we can find peace in the midst of emotional unrest. Rather than trying to escape our feelings, we can learn to honor them, knowing that they, too, are part of the beautiful, ever-changing flow of life. Chapter 6: The Wisdom of 3 a.m. Picture this: the clock strikes 3 a.m. The world is still, the silence is overwhelming, and you're wide awake, your mind racing with thoughts you can't quite quiet. It's easy to see this moment as an inconvenience, a disruption to your peaceful sleep. But what if I told you this early morning hour, the hour many dread, holds a profound opportunity, a hidden gift? In the Buddhist tradition, we are taught that change is inevitable. But change is not something to fear. It is the essence of life. Our bodies, our emotions, and even our sleep patterns are constantly evolving. And though waking up at 3 a.m. might feel like an unwanted disruption, it can actually be an invitation. It is an invitation to embrace the changes, to connect deeply with ourselves, and to practice mindfulness in a way that we might never have considered before. These early morning moments are not interruptions, they are moments of profound reflection. In the quiet, when the world is still and nothing demands your attention, you are left alone with your thoughts and feelings. Instead of feeling frustrated or defeated, see this time as a rare opportunity to listen to the wisdom within. Take a deep breath, slow down, let the stillness guide you. In these moments when the mind is most vulnerable, there lies a profound chance for growth, for self-reflection, and for reconnecting with your true self. The wisdom of 3 a.m. is there, waiting to be discovered, if only you choose to embrace it with mindfulness and compassion. This is not just about sleep or the lack of it, it's about understanding that everything, even our most challenging moments, holds within it the potential for peace. So the next time you find yourself awake at 3 a.m., don't rush to silence your mind. Instead, line in, honor the rhythm of your life, embrace the change, reflect on the journey, and allow yourself to find peace in the stillness. Now, if you found this insight valuable, don't keep it to yourself. Like, comment, and share, because this video is just the beginning. Subscribe to stay connected, and remember, the wisdom of life often comes in the quietest of moments. Let's continue this journey together.